Hello from blustery Galway on the west coast of Ireland. I've been thinking about the topic of Holocaust trauma specifically because it's come up as a question in a number of the events I've done here. And it's really been a great trip, and I'm really appreciative to everyone who's come out, and looking forward to the event at Whelan's in Dublin tomorrow night, Sunday. But on this trip, I think something's crystallized for me about why the topic of Holocaust trauma has been grating on me and disturbing me. Because when it comes to the conversation about the state of Israel and its actions in Gaza and what the Palestinians are suffering, there's something just off about the way Holocaust trauma and intergenerational trauma is used, I think. It's not that it's not relevant. It's not that the two genocides aren't connected. And it's not that we shouldn't keep it in mind or speak about it or anything like that. But I think we really have to be careful with our language, because it can end up in some ways flattening and cheapening both events. And in some ways give ammunition to our adversaries, but mainly just kind of make our analysis more vague, and thus our activism less effective, and our ability to persuade and communicate, but also just our clarity. And I think being clear in and of itself is really important. So I don't know if you watching can feel into the kind of fuzziness of this topic, but I want to see if I can clarify things in this video as concisely as I can. So as far as I see it, there's three problems with the formulation: the Jews were traumatized in the Holocaust, and now they're passing on their Holocaust trauma to the Palestinians. Number one, the one that's always been obvious to me, is just a chronological one. It's a sequential one. The Holocaust happened in the 40s. If you want to start the clock at the rise of the Nazis, you could say it started in 1933. I mean, more generally, anti-Semitism in Europe goes back centuries. But the event called the Holocaust has a, definite period of time, which is rather brief, which is one reason why I've always been uncomfortable with the claim that it's the singular biggest crime ever committed. If you want to call it the most concentrated crime by, the efficiency of it and the brevity of it, cross-referenced with the scale of it, sure. But I don't know how you're going to tell me that 5 years of the extermination of 6 million people is somehow worse than 400 years of the enslavement of an entire race of people, millions of them, on the continent I was born, or the concerted continent-wide decimation of a native population. But anyway, it's certainly up there in the top tier of horrific genocides, but it happened in the 40s. And Zionism started way before that. Zionism started in the late 1800s, and you could say that it started in response to a creeping sense of dread and foreboding. That was certainly part of it, a sense that bad things were coming, and, worse things were coming, and bad things were already here. Discrimination and outright violence and oppression against Europe's Jews in various places. But the state of Israel was created in 1948. The Holocaust ended in 1945. And so you can only say that those events accelerated the creation of the state of Israel. It accelerated the sense of urgency the Zionists felt. It also accelerated sympathies in the international community by a huge margin, and a sense of guilt and responsibility that allowed them to want to expedite the process of the creation of Israel, which created the opportunity for the Zionist movement to do what it had been planning to do all along, as Ilan Pappé makes clear in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. They had their moment, and the Holocaust, in many ways, created the perfect storm. So it just isn't true that Holocaust trauma is the reason for Israel, or that it's the reason for the plan to ethnically cleanse and, where necessary, try to destroy the Palestinian population. I guess the original plan was expulsion, but it was really the elimination by any means. And Ben-Gurion's diaries and other internal Israeli documents show very clearly that there was a complete willingness to treat Palestinian life as secondary to the goal of an exclusively, or at least majoritarian, Jewish state. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, not over half, but a plurality of Israeli Jews are not European derived. They're Mizrahi Jews or Sephardic Jews, the Jews of the Middle East, Africa, and other places. And there were a small number of those who went through the Holocaust due to various circumstances. But no, obviously the Holocaust was a European phenomenon conducted against overwhelmingly Ashkenazi Jews, like me and my family. And so it's just not true that the Mizrahi Jews were terrorized by the Holocaust or traumatized by the Holocaust, except maybe indirectly. But it's just a totally different order of trauma, so as to be kind of irrelevant. Now, they do have their own trauma, which we don't learn as much about. But that trauma involves the creation of the State of Israel and the consequences for their relatively secure and peaceable existence in Arab countries, which was never perfect. No minorities anywhere have a perfect life. But overall, to hear people who lived it tell it, whether they're Jews of that generation from Iraq or Morocco or Tunisia or other places, or their Arab neighbors who had to watch these people either be expelled after the creation of Israel or be induced by really shady means by the Zionists to leave, which you can read about in Avi Shleim's work. What was disrupted was millennia-old coexistence and actually an identity as Arabs of the Jewish faith, just like there are Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs. So their trauma has to do with having become Israeli, actually. And that's a very complex and very interesting and very important story to tell if you want to understand Israeli trauma. And I think it's important to understand Israeli trauma. But that ain't Holocaust trauma, folks. It's just not. But the final reason, which only clicked for me recently, is that the very term Holocaust trauma at this point, this many generations down the road, I think is misleading. I think it would be more accurate to say that Israel has Holocaust psychosis. It has the after effects of the original trauma, which have been filtered through many generations now of what Israel has done with the Holocaust trauma. It's festered and turned into something else. Like, I'm just unwilling to say that the trauma that my grandmother carried her whole life from having her parents and her whole family wiped out, and the trauma that my father still carries to some extent in his nervous system as a result of having been born there and barely survived, and all of the stresses of that, is the same as an Israeli child growing up today in an educational system that teaches them that the Holocaust means fuck the world, don't ask me for shit, to quote Biggie Smalls, right? That the whole world's against us, we can do whatever we want, anything, any charge of crime against us is anti-Semitic, ipso facto. No, that's not the same trauma. They are not traumatized by the Holocaust. They're traumatized by a series of events that ensued after the Holocaust. Now, look, if you want to say, well, intergenerational trauma, it's passed down, that's true. But then you could say we're all traumatized by what happened in the Garden of Eden. It depends where you want to start the clock. And at a certain point, we have to draw distinctions. So I'm going to call it Holocaust psychosis. What is that? It's psychosis about the topic of the Holocaust that is a function of being inculcated in Israel in a Zionist education system, which teaches you from a young age that the world hates you, and therefore, screw the world, that you get to do whatever you need to do to feel safe, even if it's not making you safe, that the people to whom you're doing it are less than human, and so on and so forth. And then actually rears you from a very young age to hate and to prepare to join the army that's going to enforce that hate. Or at the best, that indifference, which is just as murderous as hate. And that sends Israeli kids by the droves to Europe to weep and shake and cry and hold each other draped in Israeli flags at the sites of my great-grandparents' death and the death of 6 million, specifically not to learn history, not to learn the whole context of the Holocaust. I did when I was living in Israel and we did an optional 10-day trip to Poland. We had a tour guide who had lived through all that, and he told us about the thousands of years of relative coexistence, or at least, relative security for Jews in Poland up to the Holocaust. So we learned about the whole... That's not what Israeli Jews learn. All they learn is what the version of the Holocaust that says never again for us. And therefore, when we go back to Israel, we're going to be even more attached to this state and this flag and this national anthem and this army, which I am preparing to go into as a good Israeli. So they're primed. They're primed. That's not the Holocaust that did that to them. That's Zionism that did that to them. And Zionism is not primarily, in the main, a response to the Holocaust. The Holocaust just kicked it up a notch, to quote Emeril Lagasse. Why am I quoting Emeril Lagasse? Whatever. I'm a free associator. So that's what I'm saying. It's actually a desecration to the memory of the Holocaust victims. It's false history. It doesn't explain anything, and it leaves us just kind of circularly repeating these simplistic explanations that don't explain anything. And you know what? If I was a Palestinian, well, I'm not, and I'm already sick of hearing about it. If I was a Palestinian, I wouldn't want to hear the word Holocaust, capital H, ever again, because it's been so cheapened and used as a weapon against my people. And that's horrible. That this event that we're supposed to never forget and we're supposed to learn from. As Norman Finkelstein wrote about 2 decades ago, the Holocaust industry is about profiting from the Holocaust and exploiting the Holocaust and using the Holocaust to immunize Israel from the critique it so richly deserves and from opposition that it so richly deserves and resistance that it so richly deserves. And I refuse anymore to let my speaking collude with that. I think we have to make these distinctions. So no, the Palestinians are not the recipients of handed down Holocaust trauma. They're the recipients of mutated Holocaust trauma, but mutated in a very specific laboratory called nationalist, tribalist, racist, ethnocentric, paranoid fascism, which was a choice that some Jews made long before Auschwitz was ever associated with mass extermination.